So this morning while I was listening to Luke Thomas interviewing Dan Hardy, they were discussing Renato Moicano and his loss to the Korean Zombie over the weekend. And Luke Thomas brought up that Moicano was put against Aldo in his fight before this, and that he was probably one fight away from fighting for the featherweight title against Max Holloway. Well, he loses the fight to Aldo, but he's still ranked in the top 5 in the division, is still hyped as a contender, as a potential title contender. But then he goes in against the Korean Zombie and gets knocked out in less than a minute. And Luke Thomas brought up the question is, at what point do we stop considering somebody a potential contender? To basically, when do we put them in the bust category? They didn't boom, they bust. And Dan Hardy came back with what I thought was an excellent analysis of that question by stating that, this isn't boxing. MMA is a hardcore sport, but it's also a very forgiving sport. That we've seen in the past in MMA short history that there's been a lot of examples of guys who have fallen down only to rise up again, and that we give grace to these fighters for bad performances because there's so many variables in MMA with all the different disciplines, all the different techniques, the small gloves, all the different things that you could get caught with, and all the different factors that go into coming into a fight. That we give some grace period for these guys to fall down, but then to get up again. And it got me thinking, there's a lot of examples of this. Number one, one that just sticks out right to me right off the bat is Robbie Lawler, who went through a lot of an up and down stage in his career, only to come back and have the best string of years of his career when he returned to the UFC and be the UFC welterweight champion. Another example of this for me would be Donald Cerrone, who's had a lot of ups and downs and has stayed resilient. And even though he's faced hard losses, 2 losses to RDA, a loss to Leon Edwards, a loss to Darren Till, first round finish from Darren Till, a first round knockout at the hands of Anthony Pettis, getting his face boxed in by Nate Diaz, 2 losses to Benson Henderson. He stays consistent, becomes the winningest fighter in Zuffa, just continues to take fight after fight, and he's one of the people's champs, one of the people's most beloved fighters. Another example of this would be Nate Diaz. Nate Diaz is a guy who was a journeyman, really, at lightweight. He fought for the title at one point, but he wasn't really ranked up there as one of the top, sellers of pay-per-views and one of the, biggest stars of the sport. But yet he just fell into the right place at the right time, gets a fight with Conor McGregor and makes the most of it. And not only wins the first one, has a great classic in the second one, and has become a household name. And I also think it's relevant, that question and this topic, for this weekend, with the main event of UFC on ESPN 3 between Junior Dos Santos, former heavyweight champion, and Francis Ngannou. Let's start with Dos Santos. Dos Santos was a guy who was a former heavyweight champion. Rises up the ranks of the UFC, knocking everybody out, and then goes and flatlines Cain Velasquez to take the belt in less than a minute on the very first Fox card. Well, after that, he defended his belt, and then he meets up with Cain again twice and just gets battered. Goes through hell for 10 rounds in those 2 fights. Second one, he gets finished in the 5th round. And then from there, he pulled together some wins, but he goes in and gets knocked out by Alistair Overeem. He gets knocked out in the second Stipe fight. And a lot of people were thinking that his best days were behind him. But now look at him. He's on a 3-fight win streak, and he seems to be putting together a really good string and having kind of a late career resurgence. And now he's probably 1 fight away from being the number 1 contender in this division again. Well, then let's look at Ngannou. Ngannou was billed as the scariest man this division's ever seen. Knocking everybody out. Goes in there and about kills Alistair Overeem. There was heavyweights reported that were trying to see if they can talk to nutritionists to see if they can make 205 to avoid having to fight this man. Scary. Goes in there against Stipe, and all the hype is on Ngannou. All the hype's on the challenger, not on Stipe. And he goes in there and gets ran over for 5 rounds by Stipe, a true champion. And then what did the reports the next week? Francis is a bust. Francis was all hype. But now look at where he's at. He's come back, and then he had a horrible fight. I failed to mention that. Horrible fight with Derek Lewis, where they literally do nothing for 15 minutes. One of the worst fights in UFC history. Now he's timid. Now he's a bust. And now he's washed up. He's never going to be nothing. He's a laughingstock. People are high on him 1 minute, and then he's nothing the next. But now look at him. He's come back and got a few quick knockouts again, and now he's probably one fight away from being the number one contender again. He's back to that mantra of being the scariest man in the heavyweight division. MMA, just like a lot of other sports, has got to be one of the most fair weather sports in terms of its fans and reporting. People are high on you 1 minute and low on you the next. And it reminds me of the old saying that you're only as good as your last fight. But we shouldn't be so quick to write people off. People grow, people get better, people learn from losses. Sometimes a loss is the best thing that ever happened to them. And I think that that's played out very much in what we're going to see this weekend. Either we're going to see a great story on one hand of a former champ who's having a career resurgence late in his career, going back all the way, getting all the way almost to a title fight, or we're going to see a guy who was brought in, killing everybody, took a hard loss, but it only made him better, and now he's back for another shot. Stay tuned for the CRP and UFC on ESPN 3 this weekend.